Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this EPE session on what to expect if you're expecting a corporate evaluation of gender mainstreaming. My name's Heather Bryant, and I'm an evaluation advisor at the UNDP Independent Evaluation Office, and it's my pleasure to moderate this panel discussion today. First, just one order of business before we go any further. We are recording this session, so I hope you're all comfortable with that. Next, as we get started, I'd like to begin by recognizing the co-conveners of the UNEG Working Group on Gender Equality, Disability, and Human Rights, Tara and Sabas. Thank you, Tara and Sabas. Without you, we wouldn't be here in this session today, and we wouldn't be here either without our organizing committee of the EPE, so thanks to them, and to Thomas at UNICEF, who's helping us with the technical aspects today. So today we have a panel discussion with 6 panelists. Our original idea for this session was to have a conversation rather than a series of formal presentations. However, we are a bit limited in terms of time. We have 45 minutes. And so we're still going to go about this in a fairly structured manner. Our panelists are going to share with us some of the challenges they've faced and solutions they have found in conducting corporate evaluations of gender mainstreaming, so that you may have some ideas of what to expect if you're soon going to be carrying out such an evaluation. We're going to organize this conversation roughly along the lines of the process of carrying out an evaluation, beginning with some of the challenges related to scoping an evaluation and getting them started. Then moving on to conducting an evaluation and some of the data collection challenges and some of the tools we've adopted. And finally, to wrapping up and actually using an evaluation. We do want this to be interactive, but we'll hold questions until the end so that each of our panelists has a chance to intervene. We are asking them to be brief so that you will have a chance to ask questions at the end. So please go ahead and post your questions as they come to you, as they arise in the chat. And if your question is for a specific panelist, if you could just let us know. So Marianne Schmidt will be helping me monitor the chat and helping me with the Q&A session at the end. So are there any burning questions or technical challenges before we get started, or are we ready to go? I guess we can get going. So with no further ado, let's hear from our colleagues. As you all know, the first step in an evaluation is agreeing on the objectives, the scope, and the purpose. And as with any corporate evaluation, you may expect some challenges at this stage of your evaluation. Julia Engelhardt, you're a senior evaluation officer at the World Intellectual Property Organization. Could you tell us a bit about getting your evaluation of WIPO's policy on gender equality off the ground? Over to you, Julia. You're still muted, Julia.
Yes, thank you, Heather, for your introduction, and thank you to everybody for being present today. I will try to be as brief as possible, and I have only 4 minutes, so I am conscious of that. The evaluation of audit, the evaluation of the WIPO's policy on gender equality was conducted between March and June 2019. We had a team of 2 evaluators, and our budget was actually very limited too, so we only had 10,000 Swiss francs plus our time as evaluators in the organization. So 2 evaluators were accompanying this evaluation. It was a strategic evaluation. We looked at the programmatic and human resources part of the evaluation policy. So considering the limitations, I will give you just a brief background and only mention the most critical aspects on 3 areas, namely the theory of change, the bias that you will encounter in some evaluations, and the trust that you will have, as a limitation sometimes when doing those evaluations. Let's start with the first one, the theory of change. The challenge is not whether you have a theory of change, but whether the organization has agreed on how to approach, in this case, the evaluation of gender equality. How did they want to implement the policy, and what did they want to achieve? In the sense of a common agreement, the evaluation team decided on building consensus before starting the evaluation. We included decision makers and agreed with them on what they wanted to achieve and what did they see was their contribution and added value. This was an essential stage during the terms of reference process because it helped us to guide the whole evaluation. As you can imagine, in the absence of a common framework, there were many understandings of what gender means, gender's definitions were mixed, interpretations were quite diverse, and even people's knowledge of the policy were quite diverse. So having these clear understandings before starting the evaluation was essential for us. The second aspect we had was, how do we deal with biases? And here we are not referring only to bias in terms of gender bias, but all those sort of biases that you will encounter, like for instance, reporting bias, people trying to hide you information because they just want you to see one side of the picture, or people trying to interpret data in, which we will call the confirmation bias. When people are telling you stories, like for instance, we were told the story like, we don't have enough women at professional level because there are not enough women who apply for this sort of jobs. So those are sort of stories you will get as evaluators, which are confirmation bias because you don't have data that are backing up those stories. So you as an evaluator need to make sure that you identify those biases and find strategies to deal with those. In these evaluations also, in the evaluation we did, some key decision makers were not keen for the evaluators to look at workplace progress in terms of gender balance. So they also were very keen for us to look only at gender mainstreaming across programs implementation, but not in the organization. And as you can imagine, that was an essential part of any gender evaluation. So this required for us as evaluators to do some hand-holding process with decision makers. Our strategies to reduce those biases were the following, which was the framing of the strategies through clarification sessions combined with focus group sessions to identify areas of common analysis. So we didn't just only go by what people were telling us, but during the TOR's process framing, we said, okay, let's have some sessions to find common areas of analysis. We tried also to make the evaluation relevant because we saw that actually not always people felt included, as you can imagine in these processes. So we provide a space for open participation and revisit assumptions. For that, we organized 13 sessions in which we discussed the various aspects of the policy and agree with the gender focal point, the critical definitions of gender in advance. We made the process of indicators, agreement, and data gathering as transparent as possible, and included especially people who were or had stronger biases during that process. People who didn't believe in the evaluation. So we asked, for instance, very strongly human resources to be included because they were also very skeptical about the evaluation. So they were essential part in providing us with data that they already had. They just haven't analyzed the data. So they would analyze partly with us the data and confirm some of those biases or look at the biases they had through the data analysis they were doing with us. The last point of my intervention was the trust. Okay, as you see, we have done already a few things to build trust, but there were other components that we added to that. We thought actually, if people do not have trust, maybe we need to bring on board some agents that will help us to build that trust. And one of those agents were the staff association. So we asked them directly if they could help us to raise awareness about this evaluation and to bring on board people who actually have been raising issues about gender in the organization. So they were the ones who were distributing all our invitations for the focus group sessions, for instance, the staff association. We invited also people like the Ombudsman Office to do some presentations during the focus groups to explain what are the issues they had identified through staff. And also we had in WIPO a WIPO psychology. So we also invited her to participate. The other thing we did was to put in place the reference group with representation of all the sectors. So there was, for each sector in the organization, we asked them to send some representatives to be part of the reference group to not only, give their opinions, but also to look at the various aspects of the evaluation, like even the draft report, to provide us feedback during all those processes. And of course, we made the report publicly available. So the questions now maybe to you all, and probably you all have done also some evaluations and have come through those sort of challenges. Questions is whether we could have done better. I think we could have done better. We could have done more, especially in increasing the buy-in of leaders and getting more commitment in understanding the evaluation after the report was finalized. So to sum up, maybe some of the strategies that I would like you to remember for your future evaluations was, make sure you build consensus, you frame the strategies, make the evaluation relevant, not only just invite people, but give them the opportunity to make sure that everyone in the organization has the time should be correct for them to be able to participate. Provide the space for this sort of participation. Include critical evaluation agents in the evaluation process, especially those that have strong biases. And invite critical experts to be presenters in some essential focus group discussions. So don't only bring the evaluators on board, but bring also those people who are good influencers in the evaluation process. So that's my key message. Thank you very much for allowing me to present this. And I stay at your disposal in case you have any questions. And back to you, Heather. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia, for that very clear introduction. I think the word that I retain most from your presentation is the word trust. And I think that one of the lessons for us here, if we're about to embark on a corporate evaluation of this nature, is that we may expect to spend some time establishing that trust and consulting with stakeholders to agree on the scope and objectives of the evaluation, and then maintaining that trust throughout the process. So thank you once again, Julia. Moving on to our next panelist, Deborah McQueenie, who has just changed her background from gray to blue.
Magic.
Deborah is a senior evaluation officer in WFP's Office of Evaluation. And I think I can speak for all of us that we'd like to congratulate WFP for being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. I think as part of the UN family, we're all very proud of our sister agency. So congratulations.
Thank you.
But coming back to evaluation, in your case, when initiating your recent evaluation of the WFP gender policy, your starting point was the previous evaluation and the implementation of its recommendations. Could you tell us a bit about some of the positive aspects and some of the challenges of this situation as you started the new evaluation?
Yes, with pleasure. And thank you very much for the warm welcome. It's really a pleasure to join the discussion today. As you said, our recent evaluation was of the WFP gender policy, which was from 2015 to 2020. That policy was developed following an evaluation of the previous policy from 2009. And some of the key conclusions of the previous evaluation that we really took to heart were the following. The evaluation of the 2009 policy made note that the previous evaluations, in fact, had similar conclusions and similar recommendations, and that really it was a call to change, a call and a challenge to the organization's management to really be sincere and committed in addressing gender equality and gender mainstreaming issues. So this was a very, very strong and powerful recommendation. There was also an identified need to establish a clear corporate understanding that gender mainstreaming would facilitate WFP's effective delivery on its mandate, rather than competing with it or with other priorities. And that to do this, a shift in mindset was needed so that everyone considered gender to be their business, so it considered everyone's business. So following this call to action, WFP actually undertook a broad participatory process to develop a new gender policy. And in doing so, developed many elements that were quite innovative for WFP at the time. And these included a theory of change, and we heard from WIPO how important this is as well. A theory of change was developed, and this is in 2014, 2015 in WFP, and it's still not something that's widespread in WFP, so very much an innovation for the organization at that time. And the theory of change identified a policy goal, which was to enable WFP to integrate gender equality and women's empowerment into all of its work and activities, and to ensure that different food security and nutrition needs of women, men, girls, and boys are addressed. And this goal was supported by 4 clear objectives to drive programming results with related program indicators and underpinned by 9 program processes and elements of organizational change with clearly defined accountabilities. So together, these elements were intended to mainstream gender throughout the organization, not just in its programming work, with minimum standards identified in a range of areas. And in addition to the gender policy, it was followed up with the development of a gender action plan and regional strategies. So when we turn to looking at the context of this policy framework, when we were beginning to look at evaluating the 2015 gender policy, we really did start off by identifying a number of strengths. And that was that this participatory approach to policy development was really very clearly embedded in the policy itself and in the development of the regional plan. So there had been really an attempt to bring everyone on board and have very much a stakeholder-driven process. There was a very clear policy framework, which included a theory of change, and that focused both on programmatic and organizational goals, as I mentioned, with clearly identified minimum standards in both areas. The issuance of the Gender Action Plan to support the implementation of the policy the year following its approval had detailed accountabilities and performance measurement tools and indicators. Further, there was a strong accountability framework in the policy linked to the UN SWAP indicators, among other things. So that when it came time to pilot and adopt the Gender SWAP 2.0, there were really direct already and useful linkages to the Gender Action Plan and to other programs that were devised and created, institutionalized, rolling out gender mainstreaming throughout WFP's offices at the country level. There was also a very strong focus on gender equity, given the UN Secretary General's mandate that came through very strongly from the leadership of the organization. And there were very positive efforts to mainstream gender across WFP's organizational functions. And that has contributed to a conducive enabling environment for gender equality and women's empowerment. However, there was a bit of inconsistency in how that was mainstreamed through certain areas of the organization. It happens in some places more than others. So when we took, looking at those strengths, I think it was important to acknowledge them, but we also, of course, looked at many areas where there were challenges. So the gender policy and the action plan were both highly ambitious, but we found, in fact, with the evaluation that there were quite low levels of awareness on the accountabilities in specific areas. There was also very low levels of reporting across the range of indicators. So as a whole, it made it very difficult for the organization and then for us as evaluators to get a sense of progress across the organization on the various targets that had been identified. The leadership focus on gender parity, despite it being positive, it overshadowed other important areas of work across the gender mainstreaming and equity and empowerment dimensions. And weaknesses in WFP's resourcing for and accountabilities to the operationalization of the gender policy across headquarters, regional bureaus, and country offices have undermined the organization's ability to ensure that gender equality and women's empowerment becomes an integral part of the culture and learning of WFP. So there really was insufficient human and financial resources to roll this very ambitious policy and action plan out from the regional level all the way through to the country level and lower. So while WFP has established the basic resources to support its work towards gender equality and women's empowerment, its human resource investments in particular have not met with the stated commitments. So WFP, it was determined, needed to really properly resource and support its gender architecture in order to operationalize the tools that exist and build the capacities of its employees. So finally, just to mention some of the recommendations that were made, we recommended that there be an updating of the policy to really reframe the governance, leadership, financial, and employee-related benchmarks, to introduce language around leaving no one behind and intersectionalities, and also to mainstream gender into midterm reviews and evaluations of the country strategic plan frameworks, as well as designing future country strategic plans. So really embedding into the main programming framework of the organization. So I'll stop there. I think just to link back perhaps to a main message, because it speaks a little bit to what my colleague Julia mentioned. Really the utilization focus on this evaluation was very strong, building on the strong participatory approach to the policy development. I think we worked hand in hand with the Gender Office and its commitment to ensuring strong, not just mainstreaming, but dissemination of the policy and also of the evaluation results to strengthen gender equality and women's empowerment throughout WFP. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Deborah. I think Deborah shared a really inspiring message. She's showed us that evaluations really can catalyze change. And she's told us how WFP's evaluations have really helped the organization continue to improve on gender mainstreaming, as well as on ensuring that no one is left behind. So we've heard now about some of the bigger picture issues you may face when initiating or carrying out such an evaluation. But what are some of the challenges you face when you're in the heart of the evaluation, when you're actually carrying out the data collection? What are some of the challenges we face there? Andrea Lee Esser, you have worked on UNICEF's evaluation of its Gender Action Plan. Could you tell us a bit about this and maybe some of the challenges that you faced in the actual conducting the evaluation phase? Over to you, Andrea.
Surely. Thank you, Heather. Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, I'm a bit of an outsider, I think, within this group in that I was an independent evaluator for UNICEF's Gender Action Plan evaluation, which covered 5 years of over 2 action plans, and it was conducted in 2019. And as Heather mentioned, we're taking the microscope way down right now, and we're just going to look at one specific type of data, and that's the gender equality markers. Most of you, I think, will be familiar with these types of markers. As background, UNICEF introduced a gender equality marker in 2010, and it's the type of marker that uses the GEM 0 to signify that there was no contribution to gender, and it goes all the way up to a GEM 3. If that was the principal focus of a program, and it was applied at the program output level. So they had about 10 years under their belt already of working with this type of an indicator and strengthening their systems over these 10 years, and the marker was mandatory. From it, they were able to generate budgetary data on gender equality and women's empowerment. So they were looking at gender targeted programs, and they could also generate data on gender mainstreamed programs. And at the time of the evaluation, there was some quite exciting work coming out where they were introducing real-time dashboards that were tracking this type of data and other data at the country level, at the regional level, and global level. So it was really interesting, and a lot of it was happening during the actual evaluation. So on the one hand, as an evaluator, it was this, fantastic environment where you had this comprehensive data that was available in real time. It was across the system, looking at all the different programs. So as an evaluator, you feel as though you've struck gold, basically. And on the other hand, we had to kind of put the brakes on, right? And then start to dissect this data a little bit and look into issues of validity with data that is self-generated across such a broad institution as UNICEF is. In the case of UNICEF, we have over 14,000 people in more than 119 countries and territories. So we looked into quality assurance issues around this particular type of data. And let me just preface this by saying that these issues, I think, are not unique at all to UNICEF. There has been quite a lot of documentation and research that's gone into other institutions and other types of gender markers and the challenges associated with them. One of the things we found, first and foremost, was an element of confusion. So because it is a self-assessment, an indicator that is the GEM marker is applied across the institution, this broad institution, there was a certain amount of confusion at the field level in terms of who should actually apply the marker, when it should be applied, and how it should be applied. So we had a mix of program staff, operational staff, as well as some gender specialists in different contexts applying it with no real organization or clarity around that. The second issue was one around capacities. So there persists a lack of understanding still about gender within the institution. And I think, again, this is not unique to UNICEF. And then there was certainly confusion around the code definitions. And this was the case despite quite concentrated effort on the part of the institution from the highest levels to provide guidance. So what the result of that was that you ended up with coding issues. And I would classify those issues as miscoding issues. A certain amount has been written about the tendency for overcoding, whereby by and large, people are tending to aim higher with their codes and elevate their markers consistently, and we'd call that overcoding. But what we found, at least in the case of UNICEF, was that we certainly had a fair bit of undercoding as well. So we had overcoding, we had undercoding, and I would just say it was miscoding. And it seemed to be linking back to issues around the capacities themselves rather than an agenda necessarily to overcode. So given all of this, how do we approach this data? And I'm just going to run through a few implications and considerations then for corporate evaluations. The first, I think, is to recognize that this type of marker data does represent extremely valuable information, but we need to recognize what they can and what they can't do. First of all, they will provide indicative information that can show trends. And this is true even if they are accurately applied. They will tell you nothing about the quality or impact of programming. So it's really important to keep that in mind and how this data can contribute to your broader triangulation, but it certainly is not a holy grail. Secondly, I want to emphasize some means of, I suppose, digging deeper to understand how in your particular context you might best utilize the data that is generated. I think you need to assess the accuracy of the data in order to understand how it can be applied in a corporate evaluation. Now, clearly you can't go and look at all the different GEM codes that were done globally for UNICEF, but what you can do, and what we did do, was we looked at the usefulness and the reach of the capacity development materials and initiatives on GEM coding that had been instituted throughout the system. That was one thing. We also evaluated the institutional mechanisms that were or were not in place for quality control around the GEM coding. And we looked at this at all levels, but particularly at the lowest levels, at the field level where the coding takes place. And the third thing, which I guess is always important for evaluators, is that we listened, in the sense that we asked open-ended questions and we collected qualitative data on the experiences that people were having around their GEM codes, coding their GEMs, applying their GEM codes to their programs. We listened to those experiences and those perspectives from all of the different levels throughout the institution. And we found that people were able to, the stakeholders themselves were bringing forward issues that were relevant to the particular, this type of data. So in closing, I would just highlight that an expanded analysis such as this that I'm describing, that looks more deeply into the process itself that supports the application of a corporate gender equality marker, will help evaluators to figure out how to best actually utilize this actually very unique and very important data set within the context of a corporate evaluation. Thank you. Back over to you, Heather.
Thank you, Andrea, for this very, very interesting summary of how you used and how you analyzed and some of the challenges you faced with the GEM or the gender marker. I'm sure other organizations have faced or may face similar challenges. I know UNDP did. UNDP also has a gender marker and conducted an evaluation of gender mainstreaming in 2015. So let me turn to my colleague Ana Rosa and ask her, what were some of the solutions you found or complementary tools you developed to build on the data that you had available with the gender marker? Over to you, Ana.
Thank you, Heather. Hello, everybody. Very nice to be here with this group of wonderful presenters. Great opportunity to share and to learn. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the GRESS. Some of you have heard, and many of you have even used the GRESS. We recently learned that quite a few colleagues are already using the GRESS in their organizations, their UN organizations, and their different evaluations. So I will quickly give you a quick overview of the GRAS, and then later I'm going to give you a bit of the what's new. You've been through some of these presentations in previous EPEs. What do we have to say that is new about the GRAS? So as you know, the GRAS we developed during our 2015 gender mainstreaming evaluation that was led by our dear colleague Chandi. And we had an army of collaborators. I say collaborators because it was more than consultants. We had a number of cheerleaders really try to support this evaluation. And we worked with a methodologist, Alexander Pittman, that helped us develop this scale. And the reason why was we were a bit frustrated with what was available. As Andrea mentioned, we also have the gender marker in UNDP. But we were quite frustrated with the miscoding, as Andrea was mentioning, and also the focus on expenditures. It was misleading to only think we know where the money is going into gender. And then we also would look at the evaluations, and we would see that people would look at this aggregated data, they would mention men and women, they wouldn't. Well, actually, they would mention women and girls, not even men and boys or marginalized populations. And we were frustrated with what we're finding. And developing this scale was really an effort to look at results in a more qualitative way. So the GRAS developed this scale in 5 categories that go from gender negative, when the results had negative outcomes that aggravated the situation. Then it goes into gender blind, where simply gender was ignored or failed to really acknowledge the different needs of men and women. Then the most often that we find, it's the gender targeted, when we see attention to including people or ensuring 50-50 participation, but not going very far. And then it starts getting better. We get to the gender responsive level of the scale, where we see some of the results really trying to address the needs of men and women and the marginalized populations, and focuses on the more equitable distribution of benefits, resources, status, and rights. But the real aim is the gender transformative part of the scale, where you really, where the results contribute to really changing the norms, the cultural values, the power structures, the root causes of gender inequalities and discrimination. And it's difficult, it's not quite easy to find some of these transformative results. And the way we do this, the way we apply the GRAS, is that we first create this database of results. We apply the scale to all the results that we find, of course, having in mind that what may be coded as gender targeted in one context, where women really don't enjoy or they enjoy greater equality, then you see it as not enough result. But in some places where they're more politically repressed, then actually you may even classify it as a bit better than targeted. And then from there, you aggregate the results, calculate the numbers, the percentages, and then you interpret the results against the theory of change. Because what is very clear is that it's rare to find a transformative result if you don't really contextualize, if you don't look at it at what's the enabling environment. So you can have a policy, for example, and in a project, you can classify a legislation that passed as transformative. But we know that if you don't have the proper environments and a stakeholders mapping that really helps that legislation be implemented and promote change, then that result isn't really transformative at all. So transformation really depends on a lot more than just one result or one project or one program. So we always have to look at the GRAS against a theory of change. So I guess what I wanted to leave here as, to wrap up as my key takeaway from these efforts, because we applied the GRAS not just in our 2015 evaluation, but throughout all our evaluations UNDP now. And we try to leave the offices, especially the country level evaluations, with a message of how to reach to transformation, how to really aim at transformation. So our goal now with our recommendations and our evaluations is to convince UNDP, and this is happening in some places, to translate the GRAS into, to go beyond just effectively assessing the results, but really translate the GRAS into an analytical framework for strategic program planning, design planning, and really help the countries and help nations to design and implement transformative strategies. So the GRAS these days are helping us to really go beyond just assessing and providing, better gender responsive evaluations, but really helping to drive the organization to design transformative gender responsive evaluations. Over to you, Heather. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna, for introducing the gender results effectiveness scale that I'm sure many of our colleagues are already familiar with, but really seeing that it's more than just an evaluation tool, but can then aid the evaluands in thinking about how to move forward. I'm not going to dwell here. We are running a little behind schedule. So I'd like to move on to our next panelist, who can maybe tell us something about other types of challenges that we face in conducting corporate evaluations on gender. Verena Knippel, you are Senior Gender Advisor and Principal Evaluator at UNESCO, and you're currently leading an evaluation of UNESCO's global priority, gender equality. You've shared with us in prep meetings that you have a lot of experience in stakeholder engagement, but that you also face some particular challenges in this area with this particular evaluation. Could you tell our colleagues some of the things they might expect to be faced with when they're conducting this kind of evaluation? Over to you, Verena. Verena? We see your image, but we're not hearing anything. Is anybody else hearing anything?
I see
don't hear her.
her microphone.
No.
Something, but I cannot hear anything.
Okay, well, maybe we'll jump ahead to our next panelist, and we'll come back to Verena if we can fix up her technical issues. I'd like to pass to our last panelist now. Nicola Datbaran, you're officer in charge of the program management unit at UNECE, and you conducted the first program level evaluation of gender mainstreaming in your organization. What messages do you have for our colleagues who are expecting to carry out this kind of evaluation? And maybe you could give us a little bit of information on issues you might have faced with respect to finalizing recommendations or seeing recommendations implemented. Over to you, Nicola.
Thank you, Heather, and good day, colleagues. Thank you for attending. So our evaluation of gender mainstreaming at UNECE was conducted between February and July 2019, and the management response was signed in November 19 by the Executive Secretary after presentation to our executive committee, which is a UNECE governing body. The terms of reference of the evaluation were developed in line with UNEG guidance and agreed in advance by all division directors, which proved very useful later on for the challenge I'm going to describe. So this specific challenge that I would like to present relates to the efficiency criterion, and specifically to assessing the efficiency of the gender architecture that was in place in UNECE in a small secretariat entity. So the evaluation had to overcome an expectation from the gender unit that the evaluation would necessarily lead to a recommendation to increase its staffing. just to present the fact, in ECE, there is only one gender focal point at P5 level into a broader SDG unit. And overall, 80% of ECE posts are funded from the regular budget of the United Nations, so from assessed contributions from member states. So the challenge was to find the right balance between attaining the SWAP 2 guideline, which recommends a fully resourced gender unit in order to exceed expectations, and on the other hand, acknowledging the multiple constraints of the regular budget. And in particular, there cannot be new posts unless the department receives a new mandate from the General Assembly, which was not the case in 2019. So how did we overcome the challenge? We did it through an extensive analysis of the entire gender architecture, not only the gender focal point, its TOR, but also the network of focal points in the divisions. The analysis also took in consideration UNECE mandate on gender in comparison with similar small UN Secretariat entities, and most especially the sister regional commissions. And finally, through largely outlining the constraints associated with the regular budget. And in the end, the evaluation finally recommended that all divisional gender focal points be at P4 level and spend 20% of their time on gender. That was one way to increase the gender architecture, and on the other hand, to add one more staff dedicated to gender studies, but if possible, by fundraising for an extra budgetary project on gender and hiring an associated P4 project manager. More details on this evaluation are available in the report or in the management response, which are both available in the Open UNECE website and I think also in the UNEG website. Over to you, Heather. Thank you.
Nicolas, thank you so much. I think one thing I take away from your sharing is the importance of coming up with realistic recommendations at the end of the evaluation so that we can actually see them implemented. Verena, are you back online with us?
Yes, I am. I think I'll skip the camera and hope that we'll manage this way. Sorry, we are having internet problems at UNESCO. So I'm on 4G now. Let's, fingers crossed. I'll try to catch up.
Okay, great. Well, I think this is another example now that we are conducting our evaluations remotely. Having this kind of technological challenge is another element we're facing, but we're managing to get around it. So you were going to tell us a little bit about stakeholder engagement, if you'd like to just jump in and go ahead, Verena.
Yes, thank you very much. So we've been conducting an evaluation of UNESCO's global priority gender equality. We've just finished it and it's published this week. I posted the link on the chat. So gender equality has been a global priority for UNESCO since 2008. There have been previous evaluations, and this evaluation was done to assess the implementation of this global priority, both within the organization and in its programs and projects. We have formed a hybrid team, including evaluation, audit, and gender specialists from within and outside UNESCO, in order to have both a high level of independence and expertise, but also relevance and ownership and a utilization focus throughout the evaluation process. The team worked very closely with the Gender Equality Division and with other stakeholders in order to ensure that the evaluation would produce relevant and reliable findings and actionable recommendations. So the process was like this. The key stakeholders were the Division for Gender Equality, the Human Resources Department, the Bureau for Strategic Planning, which works on RBM, among other things, and the strategy work, program sectors, field offices, and gender focal points. And they were involved and contributed actively throughout the process, starting with the inception phase, with the data collection and analysis, via feedback on emerging findings and discussing the recommendations and suggested actions. Stakeholder involvement and ownership and this utilization focus were really important for us, and we used different forms. So we had, of course, a reference group. We worked in the inception phase with key informant interviews. We worked with focus groups, with feedback sessions, where we shared, validated, and discussed findings and tried to deepen our understanding of issues from the different stakeholders' perspectives. But there were a number of challenges. The first one was representation. Who can speak on behalf of which group or unit or department? The second one was internal communication. Stakeholders don't always talk within their group or with each other or within their department. The third challenge is timing, and it has two components. One is when to involve which stakeholders, what point in the process. Some wanted to be involved earlier, but also as our understanding of issues evolved, we saw the need to include more new stakeholders. And the other side of the timing issue is that the rounds of involvement and comments really put a strain on the evaluation timeline, and especially the deadline for the report. The fourth challenge is ownership versus independence. Where and how do we draw the line? How can we clarify that we really value input, but we need to protect the independence of both the team and the report? And we cannot negotiate text because stakeholders don't like it. And the fifth challenge, Heather mentioned it already, is the group of special COVID challenges, which are like not being able to meet physically, which changes the character of interactions, makes the building trust and so on harder, and sometimes makes the interactions more formal or more technical. So we don't have solutions, but we have a few ideas, we have a few lessons for how we are going to approach this next time and try to do even better. And so stakeholder involvement and ownership seem more complicated because it's a cross-cutting issue. So there's not, that makes it more complicated. We also had this special situation, but here are 5 points which I think will help us and maybe you going forward with stakeholder involvement, because it's not up for negotiation, it's important, and it's not only more fun, it's also really contributes a lot. So the first one is understand. So we need to invest a little bit more in really understanding stakeholders. We do that in projects and programs, so a bit more of a stakeholder analysis is what I will do next time to really make sure I understand better who are the stakeholders and how are they connected and who doesn't or does talk with whom and so on. The second one is clarify. We need to be very clear and very outspoken about roles, timing, and limitations of stakeholder involvement from the beginning and throughout the process, reminding people. We need to, number 3, communicate actively with stakeholders throughout the process. Let them know what's going on, where we are, when will be the next opportunity for input. Number 4, care. We need to include one-on-ones, invest in and take good care of the relationship with stakeholders. Once we've earned the trust, we have to maintain it. And number 5, margins. We have to accommodate this stakeholder process. We have to have even much bigger margins time-wise to accommodate. Once stakeholders get involved, get fired up, we need to be able to accommodate their input. So 5 points: understand, clarify, communicate, care, and accommodate. And then it's just been published, so we can't really have a final say about how it went, but we have positive reactions. It's already been mentioned. It's published this week. It was eagerly expected by some stakeholders, and it has already been used by the Division for Gender Equality in their presentation at the UN SWAP 2.0 conference. So yeah, we're optimistic and we will keep working on this, and we hope you all will too, and happy to discuss more some other time when we have more time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Verena. I really liked that you brought in the idea of caring People don't always see us evaluators as being very caring. So I like that. You also mentioned the need for time, because once the stakeholders get fired up, they need time to share their views and their thoughts and their evidence. And I think we face the same challenge here. We've taken more time than we intended. I think we can go a couple of more minutes, but we are going to have to cede the floor at 10 o'clock to the second session on disability. And we probably need to give a couple of minutes in between to make that transition, but we may have time for a couple of questions. I see there was a question to Ana Rosa about the difference between the gender marker, or the GEM, and the gender results effectiveness scale. I know you've started to respond in the chat, but you maybe just want to really quickly share again the main differences, Anna?
Sure, thank you so much, Heather, and thank you for the questions, colleagues. Well, to be very quick about this, the gender marker really focused on resources. It looked at how much money would go into different outputs in different projects. So that can be misleading. You know, you have a $1 million project and you assess it as Gen 2. It doesn't mean the whole $1 million goes into gender. It means that perhaps you have more attention to that in that project. So we always found it a bit misleading. And the GRESS, you know, the gender, we really focus there on the gender results with the GRESS. And not really assessing how much money, but what kind of difference or what kind of attention and contribution it really made into the results. So it's not just the gender results, but any results, how any results affected or contributed to gender in an effective or not way. So I hope that was quick.
Great, thanks, Anna. We also have a question for Julia, who mentioned the constructing the theory of change. And Tara would like to know how the team went about this, and particularly the extent to which different stakeholders were involved in, and how the evaluators built consensus around the theory of change. Julia, would you like to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, of course. Thank you for the question. I think it was a very complex process, especially when you come to the conclusion that there is no theory of change. It's like no one wants to say there is none, isn't it? It's like you have the big cat, but no one wants to mention that there is a cat in the room. Because especially for the gender focal points, it's quite difficult, because they feel that they are responsible for having a theory of change or having a sort of framework for results. So what we did is actually try to involve her very closely and trying to develop with her, with the gender focal point, the theory of change in collaboration with all the key staff in the organization. Meaning, first we started with the senior managers in the whole of WIPO. So we went with them and asked them, you know, exactly these questions. What is what you see as the contribution? Where do you think we are adding value, you know, through the policy? Asking simple questions, and then trying to see what were the areas they felt they were contributing in the last 5 years. And then we moved further down with, you know, the middle management and the staff level. It took us some time to develop a theory of change, especially you have the issues of memory recall, you have the issues, you know, not having ideas well organized, not having things categorized. So there's a lot you have to do in between to start categorizing all this information. And I am not going to say it was easy, because again, it's the understanding that people had at all the stages of the evaluation, but it was essential that we did that part of the process as well. So it takes some time. I think for us, it took probably 3 weeks to really come up with a sort of, you know, more or less structure. I wouldn't say a complete full theory of change, but you will find the theory of change we came up in the report, which is available online. And if you have more questions, then please feel free to contact me at any time.
Great, thanks, Julia. Actually, this theory of change and the processes we go through to develop them when we're doing an evaluation, especially if there isn't already a theory of change, is an interesting one. Would any of our other panelists like to share anything about their experiences with developing a theory of change at the outset of their evaluation? Verena, Deborah, Anna, Nicola?
Yes, maybe. So we didn't have like an explicit theory of change, but we had strategic documents, the Gender Equality Action Plan at UNESCO, which sort of between the lines, or which explains, not with a visual and explicit theory of change, but which explains the dual approach for how we're going to A, mainstream, and B, sort of gender specific, through gender specific activities, implement move towards a greater gender equality with what we do. We've tried to visualize it, and we've tried to discuss it with the reference group, and what came out of that was very important and for the evaluation, and was that whereas the strategic document very clearly applies this dual approach, both within the organization and for its programs and projects outward, the sort of internal work has received much less attention. And so we have included it in our evaluation to really look also at the internal work, which also was mentioned by Deborah and others, that the sort of what we now have a new evaluation criteria from that, which is like the coherence. And when we found this really extremely important for UNESCO, and also in discussion with different stakeholders, to have organizational coherence and to look both at the inside and the outside. And this is something that became very clear when we started to visualize and started to look at it from a sort of theory of change lens, that we either need to have a third dimension, which is the internal work, or we have to somehow better emphasize in whatever form we express our theory of change, that this applies both within the organization and to the organization as a workplace and so on, and then to our outside work. I think Deborah called it the enabling environment, and that's like really super important. So I think going forward, when we now spread and discuss this evaluation, we want to use this as a point of departure for saying, how can we be more clear that this is sort of implicitly, it has been there all the time, but it hasn't really received the attention it needs in order for us to work coherently on this issue of gender equality. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I know there are many more questions, and I think we could go on for another couple of hours on this, but we do have another panel coming up starting in 1 minute in principle. So I think I will just wrap this up, and I'd like to thank all of our panelists. I would like to thank all of our participants. We've made a really quick journey through initiating a corporate evaluation on gender mainstreaming, looked at some challenges in terms of conducting an evaluation, data collection, analysis, stakeholder engagement, building trust, caring, collaboration. People aren't just consultants, but they're collaborators. And then finally, that we've seen some successes with taking up recommendations, the practicality of recommendations, and ultimately bringing about positive change in our organization. So we hope this has given you some ideas of what to expect if you're expecting a corporate gender mainstreaming evaluation. And I'm sure colleagues would be welcome to continue the discussion offline. We will be able to share more guidance on the GRESS. I know there's been a number of requests in the chat there. So in the post session documentation, we'll be sure to include more links and documentation. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining on this. And a special thanks, of course, to our panelists, to Julia, to Ana Rosa, to Deborah, to Verena, to Andrea, and Nicola. So many thanks to all, and I'll hand over to Sabas for the next session.